Thanks for coming to spend part of your afternoon with me. I'm really thrilled to see you all and to talk to you about something that I think you'll find interesting. So let me just jump in. We're seeing it, super. So my talk, as you know, is about learning, memory, and knowledge post-Google. First of all, any Google employees in the audience? Great. Okay, super. Could you move further to the back just to... Okay. No, this is not, we're not slamming Google on this one. Okay, so a lot of people love Google. A lot of us less than love Google. But I think we can all agree that we have a very intimate relationship with Google. And Google is really changing the way we think, and it's changing our brains. I spent 20 years thinking about learning and memory. And that was before Google and since Google. And I've thought a lot about the what, the content that goes into learning, but more so about the how, the learning science behind how it is that we learn, and also the why. What is the motivation behind our learning? And all three of these things, the what, the how, and the why, have been heavily influenced by Google. Some people believe that Google is replacing our brains. Is this really true? Would this be a good idea? What are the implications of that? And I think the deeper question for me, and what I want to explore with you today, is Google making us smarter, or is Google making us dumber? So you know who I am, and we're going to spend the next hour talking about this. And I'm not going to stand up here and talk at you for another 57 minutes and 33 seconds. So please think about some questions, and we'll leave a lot of time at the end to kind of discuss this, because I'm really curious about what you all think. I want to give you a little bit of background on who I am to set some context for this talk and why I'm in front of you today. As Val said, I'm co-founder and CEO of Cerego. We're a company with a mission to improve how the world learns by building a single generalizable platform for acquiring and demonstrating knowledge and capability. Essentially, we're interested in making people smarter. And we have the privilege of working with a really interesting constellation of partners, from publishers to schools, to K-12 schools, to universities, foundations, corporations. Even the US Army is starting to work with Cerego. And we're a global company with presence all around the world. I want to give you my definition, or the working definition for this talk, of what is learning, memory, and knowledge, because I think it's important that we sort of level set. We all have different definitions of this. So for me, learning is really about the process of turning information into knowledge, whereas knowledge is the result of learning, and it's a precursor to problem solving and creativity, a very important one. And memory is the glue that binds this all together. So for this session, that's our working definition: learning, memory, and knowledge. I'll tell you a little bit about my past, because I think it's kind of relevant. How many of you have heard of the Princeton Review? The salad days. So I worked for the Princeton Review very, very early on in my career. I then moved to Japan, where I spent 25 years. I got very enamored with the work of my great-grandfather, Hermann Ebbinghaus, who basically came up with the forgetting curve, or the learning curve. How many are familiar with Ebbinghaus? Okay. And so Ebbinghaus basically figured out that when we forget information, it doesn't just simply fly out of our heads. It descends along a predictable function. And that gave a really interesting breakthrough, and really that kicked off the field of learning and memory, taking advantage of that. So in Japan, I built a product called I Know. I wrote a couple books about learning and memory. And we helped about 3 million learners, Japanese people, learn English, which was a whole lot of fun. I then moved to Silicon Valley, and I launched Cerego as a generalized platform. So this kind of covered the span from '89 to 2013 for me. And along the way in 1998, something very interesting happened. This little company started up called Google, September 4th, 1998. Interesting to note that Apple is just such an older company. And Google has a great mission to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And I think the key here for this talk is certainly organization and accessibility and usefulness. And they do a really good business out of doing this, right? So Google generates a whole lot of money, nearly $70 billion last year. And so my question is, have we outsourced our brain to a purposely built ad server that makes $70 billion a year? And in that case, is it designed to make us smarter, or is it designed to make us dumber? So let's walk on the dark side, and let's talk about kind of getting dumber? Just show of hands. How many people think Google's making us dumber? Okay. How many people think it's making us smarter? How many people think it's in the middle? Okay. Let's see if those numbers change for the rest of this talk. So I want to talk about 3 different aspects. The what of how Google is making us dumber, the how it's impacting us, and possibly the why behind this. That was the worst Prezi-Zoom of the entire presentation, so please don't worry. If you're taking Dramamine, you're going to OD at this point. It's fine. I'm going to talk to you first about the what. Okay, how many of you saw Jaws? Great film, right? How many of you saw Jaws 2? How many of you saw Jaws in Japan? It's an outstanding film. And what's really kind of crazy is if you ask the Google about shark movies, there are tons and tons and tons of shark movies. We're kind of infatuated with the idea of sharks and shark attacks. And then I started thinking, well, what about shark attacks? Are they on the rise? Are they on the decline? So I Googled shark attacks on the rise. And sure enough, this is not good news if you live by the water. Shark attacks are on the rise. But then I thought, what if you ask it slightly differently? What if you said, are shark attacks in decline? And it turns out that shark attacks are in decline. And I think we've all been in this position, right? And so what exactly is it? What's going on here? Why is that the case? Well, as we know, there's a lot of stuff on the internet. And trying to define stuff is not easy. In 2014, we crossed the billion site mark on the internet. That's a big number. And the big 4, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Facebook alone have 1.2 million terabytes of data. A terabyte is 1,000 gigabytes. That's a lot of stuff. What's interesting, about 10 years ago, Time magazine named you or us the person of the year because we are in control of the information age. Welcome to our world. Very empowering. And a little bit before that, Clinton basically said that the new economy, information, education, motivation are everything. Very empowering statements. But what was interesting to me is that was before anybody was really making any money doing this, right? So those were early days. And now we see that what's happened is that revenue growth on advertising in the web has skyrocketed. And now it's really big business. Kind of like a light show going on back there. We okay? Well, here we go. There we go. So what's interesting about this, I think that the information age, in a big part, is sort of about availability as a priority over the accuracy of the news. That's not me, I swear. It's Google. Who said that? It is Google, right? Oh my God. Could you, sir, please? And availability is about capturing and maintaining attention. That's what it's about. And why is this the case? Well, the case is because this is accomplished through technology called ad-serving technology. We all know this. Let's ask Google for the definition of ad-serving technology. I'm going to read this with you. Ad-serving describes a technology and service designed to place accurate and reliable information in the form of advertising on websites. The primary intention is to represent the truth to the greater public, to ensure relevancy of content, and lastly, to make money for the advertising companies and related websites who are also interested in the accuracy and relevancy of information on their sites. That's a pretty great definition. Sounds like a good group. You know, if only that were true. This is the definition. I'm not going to read it for you, but the main point here is that it's all about how you're going to make the most money. That's the goal of an advertising server. It was purposely built for that, not for learning. And so what do we get when that happens? We get people who look to drive eyeballs, to get attention. And here comes the invasion of fake news. How many of you have heard of the term fake news? Okay, good. So there's always been crazy stuff out there, right? We've known this, right? How many of you grew up reading magazines like this? Do you remember this? This stuff has been out there for a long time. But here's what's changed. With the information superhighway and the myriad of links and connections that you can fall down and follow, you find some very, very strange stuff on that highway. Now, some of this stuff is harmless, right? So who's this? Oh, come on. Who is this? Anybody? Santa? It's Elvis Presley. And he's alive. This is good news. Look, He's alive. And you can find all these sites that not only is he alive, he's doing well and he's a gardener somewhere, which is kind of cool. So that's kind of harmless. Some of this stuff is more harmful. So how many of you remember these headlines? Or this one. This is my favorite one. How about this? Even Hillary endorsed him. Or this one. So this stuff is harmful. And it's not just a matter of what you do with it and you seeing it, but people are spreading this like crazy. And this is basically the spreading of a mind virus. And this is very detrimental. So how does this affect us? From the learning and memory side, how is Google kind of getting into our heads? And I want to talk to you about a concept called neuroplasticity. Show of hands, who understands neuroplasticity? Awesome, a super educated audience at South by Southwest EDU. For those of you who are catching up, it's our brain's ability to rewire. And you can look at the dates that this has become very, very popular. The whole adage of you can't teach an old dog new tricks apparently is not quite true, at least for human dogs. And let's step to the side for a second. Think of Ray Charles. How is his brain rewired? Well, to understand that, we have to understand a little bit of biology. The visual cortex, which kind of runs vision, as you can see in the nice picture, accounts for about 30 to 40% of the cortical surfaces of the brain. That's a large chunk of your brain is devoted to vision. Kind of makes sense, right? But here's what's super interesting. If you look at an fMRI of a blind person, you see that that area of the brain lights up. How can that be? They can't see, right? And that was what the purpose was. Well, it lights up when they do some interesting things. When they're reading Braille, it lights up. When they're playing music, it lights up. And the other senses have kind of taken over that part of the brain. And there have been some really interesting articles about the superpowers for the blind and deaf that kind of explains this idea of neuroplasticity and the senses taking over. And they can take over for things like hearing and touch. That's super cool. Now, this example is for people who have somehow an injured brain. What about people who don't have an injured brain? So there have been studies of London taxi cab drivers who, as we all know, have to know a phenomenal amount, have to memorize an incredible amount of information in order to pass the test, right? All those maps, which is pretty crazy. You know, they could use Apple Maps, but they don't. They use this instead. And what they've noticed is that the hippocampus of the brain of those drivers actually gets larger when they're doing their job. And then when they test retirees several years later, that hippocampus shrinks back down. So that's really interesting. Neuroplasticity at work. And so I kind of started to wonder, well, is Google rewiring our brains? And are we going to get this sort of super mind because of Google? So there have been studies about the Google effect and the consequences of the Google effect. And I'll summarize them for you from this article. First, the internet is being sort of used as this external memory for humans. We remember less through knowing information than by knowing where the information can be found, right? We remember where to go get it, not what it is, transactive memory. And lastly, our memory is fundamentally adapting to this technology, right? This adaptation is neuroplasticity. This is the rewiring of our brains. Okay, there's one small catch with this. And the catch is that the process of rewiring is value neutral. It can go up or it can go down. It can go up, our brains rewire and we get smarter, or it can go down, our brains rewire and we get dumber, in quotes. So welcome to the dark side of neuroplasticity. I talked to this gentleman. Has anybody read anything by Nicholas Carr? Anybody read this book, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, The Shallows? This guy is kind of a techno-Cassandra a little bit, super smart guy. He writes a lot of books about what technology is doing to us. So he wrote this book. He also wrote the screenplay for The Digital Dead, Rise of the Zombies, which is a joke, but it's still not good news from this book. And kind of to sum up what he thinks, Nicholas Carr believes, and he has this great analogy of once he was a scuba diver in the sea of words, and now he zips along the surface like a guy in a jet ski. And the problem with this, he believes, is that we now live in an age where we no longer value thinking deeply about anything and are continuously attracted to new information. Well, isn't that just multitasking? How many of you are good multitaskers? couple people. How many of you multitask? Right? It's like, how do we get out of this? Well, here's the problem. The research on multitasking shows that it ain't a good thing. We are much less effective when we multitask. It basically damages our ability to do quality work, and it's generally a myth. There is no such thing as multitasking. There's an article in the Harvard Business Review that you can't multitask, because what's really going on is you're not multitasking, you're task switching. You're just doing it super fast, and there's a cost to that. The cost is that you don't fully pay attention to any one task, and that's not a good thing. So this is the phenomenon of continuous partial attention, which basically means in our efforts not to miss anything, we end up paying partial attention to superficial content. And have you ever had this experience where you can't remember what you're looking for? Or how many of you have had this on Google? You're searching, and all of a sudden you're like, what was I searching for? It's not a good thing. Skimming the surface and continuous partial attention are just bad for memory, right? That's why they call it surfing, not diving. So let's talk quickly about memory and how memory is solidified through consolidation. We pay attention, we encode, we store, we retrieve. This is the vernacular of experimental psychology, the way it works. And then we repeat. Repetition is key for memory. It's a complex system. I'm not going to unpack this whole thing for you, but I will tell you that short-term memory and long-term memory are the key things to remember. And short-term memory is about repeating to remember something. I repeat it, I try to remember the name of the person I just met. And long-term memory is about remembering to repeat, that distribution of information over time. That's what's kind of key. But the thing right now is we have this sort of heat and serve mentality about finding information on the internet. And we're no longer really remembering the content, we are remembering where to find it. There's a chemical basis for this change, and it's worth understanding for a second. How many people know what this is? Anyone? Don't say DNA. Let's ask the Google. And I uploaded this image to Google, and Google image search is pretty damn cool. It says it's dopamine, okay? And dopamine is basically behind that tingle you get when you find something on the internet. You know that feeling you get, right? Except for certain sites, that's a whole nother neurotransmitter. We're not talking about that now. But here's what goes on. You start searching, you find something, you get rewarded. This is called a dopamine loop. But the thing about the dopamine loop is it's a vicious cycle. Because what happens is we develop a tolerance to dopamine, which means we need more of it. We need more of the stimulus to get the same payoff. And we need variable rewards, which means things have to constantly change or our brains won't give us what we want. So we get addicted to the new information rather than the relevant and the true. And then we need more and more to get the same fix. So this is the viciousness of the dopamine loop. And this is what we all experience when we grab our phones and we ask the Google for something. We crave something new and delicious, right? We don't want to repeat, and we want to fill up our dopamine tanks. Versus building a solid foundation, repeating that information to really instill it in our minds, and being able to then think deeply about things. We are rewiring our brains to find information rather than to remember information. And I think this is greatly detrimental. Lastly, I want to talk to you about why. So what is going on? All the time that we spend on Google, how is that changing our beliefs, our opinions about what's important, right? And I think that our beliefs about the importance of learning and memory are actually changing. So I want to talk about two gentlemen. Seth Godin. How many of you know Seth Godin? Great guy, writes great books, really interesting guy, best-selling author. Did a couple of TED Talks. I'll show you a clip of one TED Talk that he did, a TEDx talk. And then I want to talk about Eric Schmidt. You all know Eric Schmidt. He is the executive chairman of Alphabet, the parent company of Google, one of the richest men in the world. What do these two guys have in common? Well, let's find out. So I'm going to play you a quick clip that is from a TEDx talk. I cut out a certain part of this talk. I'll show it to you.
What is school for? I don't think we're answering that question. I don't even think we're asking that question. Everyone seems to think they know what school is for, but we're not going to make anything happen until we can all agree about how we got here and where we're going. Open book, open note all the time. There is zero value in memorizing anything ever again. Anything that is worth memorizing is worth looking up. So we shouldn't spend any time teaching people to memorize stuff.
I cut out the massive applause from all the teachers in the audience. He did something actually interesting in this video for 1 second. Everybody raise your hand as high as you can. Okay, now raise it a little higher. Why is that? So Seth says it's because we're trained by the education system to always hold back. Okay, maybe. So now let's look at an Eric Schmidt video. This is a bit of an older video, but I like this one as well.
Is technology doing all it can to help us? Is technology on the cutting edge? Is technology delivering its promise?
Let me give you the simple
And
case.
now what we want?
Let me give you the simple case and I think the challenging case. To me, the real question is, how does the ability to have all the world's information in front of you all the time change education? When I was 13 and I grew up in Virginia, I was required to memorize the 52 cities that were the capital cities of each county of the state of Virginia, which I mastered after a lot of work. Today, of course, there's a nice table in Google that tells me all that. I don't know why I'd have to memorize all
I could
that.
give you a test on this.
So why did I have to memorize all that? Because instead what they should have done is they should have taught me how to search for it.
Exactly.
Okay. How many people agree with these two? Okay, interesting. Well, these guys basically are arguing that memory can be outsourced, right? And that memorization is kind of a four-letter word for memory, for learning, excuse me. Good or bad? I'm not really sure. Let's look at a couple of those quotes. So Seth says there's zero value in ever memorizing anything again. Maybe that's true. I mean, come on, how many of you'd go to a doctor, right, who was operating and just Googling for everything? I mean, we wouldn't have any concerns about that. Makes sense. How many of you flew in to South by? Yeah, a lot of us, right? You get on a plane with a pilot who didn't have any foundational knowledge, right? And in the event of an emergency at 40,000 feet, they could Google very quickly to figure out what to do. That kind of makes sense, right? They don't need foundational knowledge for these things. Why would you need to know anything? Or how about the idea that anything worth memorizing is worth looking up? That sounds really good, right? But this is one of these false dichotomies. And it's like, I believe that anything we need for deeper understanding should be memorized and should be learned. This is really key, right? Let's look at Eric Schmidt. Does Eric Schmidt need to know all the state capitals of Virginia? No. No, he doesn't. I don't think he does, right? Does he need to know why they're important? Yes. How about the roles and functions of different branches of government? Do we want leaders to understand these things? Maybe it's a good idea, right? Absolutely. Especially if he's hanging out and talking to guys like this who really knew what they're talking about, right? If you don't know how government works, how can you understand the implications of a Supreme Court nomination, right? How can you understand the implications of a challenge, to an executive order? How can you run a multi-billion-dollar corporation if you don't understand this stuff? Memorization transmits culture, right? Without a foundation of knowledge, we get unchallenged facts. And that's another way of saying fake news. And I don't think that's good, right? Without the knowledge to judge, what do we do? Who do we ask? We ask Google, right? And what we end up with is Google becomes more than a bunch of words, it becomes our entire alphabet. Vicious circle, vicious cycle, shackled to Google, bad thing. How many of you read 1984? Kind of relevant, right? A lot of people think we're kind of going back there to 1984. And that would be really, really bad. Okay, take a deep breath. So, before we give up all hope, and we end up in Wisconsin. And this is Google. That thing was there. If you're from Wisconsin, it's an awesome state. Take it up with Google. There's a gentleman right there we can talk to afterwards. Let's think about maybe Google is actually making us smarter. So here, just for South by Southwest, I want to talk about how Google is possibly making us smarter. Let's talk about the what. The what? Information at our fingertips, at your fingertips, the democratization of education and access to experts. Bill Gates, addressing Comdex 1995 Seattle, talked about the computer and opening up this window to a world of information. Of course, he looked a lot younger when he was doing this. But I think Google's mission is really in line with this. Definitely it's organizing information. It's certainly more accessible. I think usefulness might need a little bit of work, but I think they're well on their way. Think about education before. Education was like real estate. It was based on location, location, location. The education you got was a function of where you lived, what schools you had access to, what libraries. Anybody remember libraries? What libraries you were close to. This defined the nature of the education that you would get. Now it's quite different. Education could be anywhere. I went to Rwanda last year. Anybody been to Rwanda? A couple people. It's a super, super interesting country. And they are hell-bent on education transformation. From the government, from the top down, they believe they can take 11.8 million sustenance workers, farmers, and make them knowledge workers. And they believe education is the key to basically revitalizing their nation. And I visited a school 20 miles down a dirt road that had smart classrooms put in by the government, where they had students that had these made in Rwanda laptops, that had access to the internet through LTE. They have 300 LTE base stations across Rwanda, which is crazy. It's a small country. And they're using Google and they're using YouTube to get access to information and to start to learn about things, which is amazing. Slight aside, down that dirt road, I checked my LTE. I was getting 80 down and 40 up on a dirt road in Rwanda. Imagine what you could put through that bandwidth in terms of education and value. It's quite amazing. The internet does more than help us find information, right? What it also does is it helps us find people and expertise. And I think that's really cool. Who is this? I heard somebody say it. He's the Elvis of statistics. Anyone? Nate Silver. Nate Silver. Nate Silver is a rock star, right? Nate Silver has over 2 million followers on Twitter. How many of you have more than 2 million followers on Twitter? Nate Silver is amazing, and Nate Silver has unlocked this excitement about math and statistics, and he basically is the go-to for all these people. And there's like Nate Silvers in all these different fields. It's quite amazing what he's done, and it's exciting. Let's talk a bit about how this transformation is occurring and what Google is doing to us on the how side. I think there's a shift to a culture of learning. I think we are unlocking talent that we've never seen before. I also think we have a greater understanding of ourselves that's very relevant. So classrooms of the past, classrooms now, they look kind of similar. I think on the negative side, we still rely on sort of old methodologies to really understand the progress of our learners and where things are at, and that's kind of unfortunate. But I do think we're making great progress. I think many of you in this room would agree that there's been a real institutional shift. Things like Creative Commons and OER, unlocking materials are amazing. The early work of MIT with OpenCourseWare, of making things available, has really kicked off a revolution, right? And that's a revolution that's led to the MOOCs. It's led to things like code.org, where you have, I don't know if you can read this, it says 17 million students account. That's 17 million kids learning to code through code.org. That's pretty amazing. It's hard to imagine what the DIY movement would look like if we didn't have Google and YouTube. It'd be a very, very different world. There's also a cultural shift, and I think this is important to think about. Joey Ito, who is the director of the MIT Media Lab, really interesting guy, has a great quote. And in his TED Talk, he talked about education is what people do to you, learning is what you do for yourself. And that's, I think, really, really a powerful quote. And it's about this sort of shift in our relationship with education and learning. And I talked to Joey last week, and I asked him, I said, Joey, is Google making us smarter or dumber? And he was kind enough to humor me with the question. And he said, well, think about the calculator, right? What has the calculator done? Well, the calculator, you could argue, has made us worse at arithmetic. That's probably true. But it's basically unlocked the path towards very, very complex problem solving that we would never get to if it weren't for the calculator. So he also pointed me at this really interesting video. He's like, you got to see this video. So I'm going to show you this video because I think it's super cool.
I first started about 7-8 months ago.
I was thinking of dancing along, but I'm not going to do that.
From a report for Michael Jackson, and I went on the internet and I fell upon dancing the dubstep, and I just started practicing and going on from there. I just go on YouTube, look up random stuff like how to dubstep or how to pop and lock, and to learn the move, I usually watch the video over and over and over. I probably watch like millions until I figure out how they do it. Sometimes you can transfer one move to another, like you just go with the flow, and it's kind of weird because I'm just like in my la la land. If you're on the internet, you can really learn and teach yourself. It benefits you by rewinding, pausing, doing all that stuff because you can watch it over and over again, but in a classroom you can't do that. Honestly, because I've learned this whole thing from the internet, and the internet is my generation to learning these things. I think I can show people that you can do anything if you really have a passion for it.
That's pretty cool, right? There's some interesting takeaways from what she's talking about. She's probably not an expert in learning and memory herself at this point, but maybe she kind of is. And she said some really interesting things. She said to learn the moves, she watches the video over and over and over. What is she doing? That's the power of repetition right there. That's how she's internalizing and ingraining those videos. It's the automaticity of sub-skills to make it just automatic and reflexive. And when you've got that, once you're at that level of automaticity, you can transfer one move to another. You can go with the flow, right? The flow is where we all want to be in terms of our lives and learning, right? And this type of mastery leads to this bloom of creativity where she's able to create new moves based upon the fact that she's internalized to that level, which is super cool. And then lastly, she says, hey, if you're on the internet, you can teach yourself anything. And that's giving personal agency to learning. And that's super powerful. I think these are really significant ways that Google is supporting this cultural shift from education to learning. People are getting really excited and empowered to shape their own futures. That's a cool thing. Back to Nate Silver. Think about the transformation in people's lives because of Nate Silver. So what do you call statisticians who move from the East Coast to the West Coast? Data scientists, yes. Data scientists. And data scientists are the new rock stars. Ranking of 50 most popular MOOCs, looking at rank like number 10 down. Number 7, algorithms, Princeton University, 751,000 learners. The data scientist toolbox Johns Hopkins, 828,000 learners. R programming, R is the language of data scientists, right? Johns Hopkins, again, 846,000 learners. Machine learning at Stanford, 952,000. And last but not least, I thought this was really cool, the number one, learning how to learn. How cool is that? UC San Diego, 1.3 million learners. That's pretty awesome. People are now empowered with the ability to shape their own brains, right? This is kind of like neuroplasticity guided by the person inside, not by the people outside. Any philologists in the house? Yes, a philologist in the house, thank goodness. Know thyself, right? Ancient Greek, good idea. And I think that this is a quest for all of us. And the good news is that we know a lot more about the psychology and the biology of how the brain works. How many of you are familiar with the term cognitive bias? Hard to miss it these days, right? It's this kind of subjective social reality that we form from inputs. And what's kind of interesting about the cognitive biases is there's a codex of cognitive biases. There's like 198 cognitive biases, from the confirmation bias to the Google bias to the IKEA effect. That's my favorite. Anyone suffer from the IKEA effect? It's the belief that if you put it together yourself, it's better. It's a cognitive bias, right? And this would look like a cookbook for the makers of fake news. But I think it can also help us out, those on the other side. This is the confirmation bias in work, right? We've all experienced this. Like, oh my God, it's true. I know none of us have done this, but we know people who suffer from these things. But I think with the understanding, we have a greater chance to recognize and correct for these biases, and then we can push the Googles and the Facebooks to fight against alternative facts. And that's a war worth fighting for. So back to my great-grandfather Ebbinghaus. We know a lot about learning and memory. The unfortunate thing is a lot of it doesn't really leave the labs. But 130 years ago, Ebbinghaus kicked off this idea of quantification of memory. Super cool. 32 years ago, Bloom showed the value of personal learning. Do you know the Bloom 2 sigma problem? This is kind of interesting for seconds. Benjamin Bloom, sort of foundational knowledge, you get the whole pyramid. This guy figured out in the 80s that if you took a class of students and you divided them into 3 groups, you took one group and you put them through mastery training, which is this idea of testing them and then helping them on the stuff that they missed on the test and then giving them the exact same test, they would get 1 sigma or 1 standard deviation against that control group of the class. Well, the 2 sigma problem, I'll tell you why it's a problem in a second, was if you took that third group of students and you private tutored them, you gave them one-to-one instruction, guess what happened? They'd score 2 standard deviations above that control group. Now, there's some arguments about why that may or may not be, but Bloom believed because personalization is very key to learning. The problem is in Bloom's time in '84, it was hard to scale personalization, right? It's not realistic to give everybody a private tutor. But maybe you can now through technology. Maybe you can get a whole lot closer. So I think that was really interesting research. And then 22 years ago, Bjork showed us that there's an optimal time to review, which is this concept of desirable difficulty, which means there's a point in time when if you review the information on that verge of boredom and frustration, do you know it, do you not know it? If you hit somebody at that moment, you have the greatest chance for deepening their knowledge. That's a really interesting finding. And all these experiments were done with very, very small numbers of participants, right? But what goes on now, in the last 5 years, we finally have enough longitudinal data on learning in the real world to put these theories into practice. And that's something I'm super passionate about in the work that we do, right? So the right data set combined with the right approach taken from the science can get you to better learning. And you can design experiences that help you build and retain knowledge. And that's kind of what we do at Cerego. I think that I could say with confidence that we have the largest data set in the world on learning and forgetting. We have several million people and all these points of data about how they learn and how they remember. And we actually lend that data out, obviously anonymized, to universities that do research in different things because up until now, you just didn't have that kind of volume of data. And so with this data-driven world that we're in, you can do a lot of great things for learning. And it's kind of cool stuff. The magic penny. So I have a proposition for you. I have a magic penny, and the magic penny doubles in value every day. So I can give you that penny, and you can hold on to it for 31 days, and then I'll give you the value at the end of the 31 days, or I'll give you $5 million right now. How many people want the penny? A penny. How many people want the $5 million right now? How many people just don't like money? Okay, some of you aren't playing along here. Well, here's the deal. For the penny, this doesn't look good because 7 days later you double and you have 64 cents. Okay, you still want the penny? Anybody want to switch doors? 31 days later you have $10.7 million from that one penny, right? And this is because little by little becomes a lot. And this is learning, right? Learning is about compounding. The more you know about something, the easier and faster it is to learn more. I think that's super cool. And this is really deep processing. This is what you want, as opposed to being very transactional in your experience with information. It's very hard to anchor anything to memory, to your brain, when you're transactional. And this gets you to very shallow processing. Lastly, and we got plenty of time for some good questions, the why. So I want to talk about why I think it's important that Google improves learning for us. And I want to talk about the societal reason, and I'll give you my personal why. So on the societal side, who would want to remember everything? Would you want to remember everything? This was very bad for Arnold. I don't know if you saw this movie, but this turns out like super bad. This is not a good idea, right? And we can obviously outsource certain things to Google, and it's important that we do that. But memory is essential for synthesis, problem solving, and creativity. You've got to have memory, right? And I think we all know there's a fair number of problems that we need to solve right now. And so we need people with that foundational knowledge. On the personal side, I really think foundational knowledge gives us a key resource to go deeper, faster, and further than ever before. I think if we combine this ubiquitous access to information with evidence-based technology, we can make us smarter, right? And so for me, in my little worldview, information into the learner is what Google does really well. Knowledge into memory is what technologies like Cerego does really well. And that's what we focus on. We're just a little smaller than Google right now. So when the robots come to get us all, and they're coming for us, creativity really becomes the new currency. And there's no creativity without memory. Thank you very much.